for those of you who may not know me, my name's Caleb. I'm from a small town in Ohio. I'm actually from Orrville, Ohio, which is where Smucker's Jelly is manufactured. When I was in my little town and we were learning different Bible verses, there's a couple Bible verses that we never went over. This is one that we missed. There's nothing wrong with being greedy, for a greedy man just wants more than he already has.
No.
I heard a voice calling from the east, death to the weak and wealth to the strong. Man is just another animal, sometimes better but often worse than those that walk on all fours. Anyone ever heard those Bible verses before?
No.
There's a reason we didn't study them in my little town in Ohio, because those verses are not from the Christian Bible. Those verses are from the Satanic Bible, written by Anton LaVey. But I have here the actual Christian Bible, and I'm going to read to you what the actual Christian Bible says on similar topics very quickly. Go away, ye rich men, and weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Behold the hired laborers, who have reaped down your fields, which you have kept back by a fraud. You have nourished your hearts in the days of slaughter.
What verse is that?
That's from the book of James. That's James chapter 5, verses 1 through 5.
I'd
Yes.
say it sounded like James.
Yes.
That was Leviticus.
Another one. And the multitude of them that believed were all in one heart and of one soul, and neither any of them had that aught things which he possessed of his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power gave the apostles witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and the great grace was upon all of them. And neither was any of them that lacked. For as many of them were possessors of land and houses, sold them, and brought the prices of things that were sold, and laid them at the feet of the apostles. And distribution was made unto every man according to what he had need.
Damn.
And that's from the book of Acts, chapter 5.
That's why they go around the church.
Chapter 4, verses 32. So those are some interesting Bible verses. And the reason I started that out is because we're going to be talking about a lot of different ideas here. And I am way past caring what you call yourself. You can call yourself a Christian, you can call yourself a Muslim, you can call yourself a Jew, you can call yourself a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Socialist, whatever you want to call yourself. And that there are Christians who are doing good right now, and there are Christians that are serving evil. And there are Muslims that are doing good right now, and there are Muslims that are serving evil. There are Jews that are doing good right now. There are Jews that are serving evil. And we need to get past the labels and the ideologies, and we need to understand where the forces of good in this world really are and where the forces of evil are. And we need to get past looking at what you label yourself. Anyone can label themselves anything. But who are you serving and what are you doing? That is what we are concerned about here today. And we're going to be talking about these ideas in a little bit of a different way than they're normally discussed. Now, one of those particular verses that I read from the Satanic Bible said, "Man is just another animal, sometimes better but often worse than those who walk on all fours." And I would agree with Anton LaVey, that is certainly a satanic idea. I don't think human beings are just another animal. But then that forces me to raise a question. What separates human beings from animals? Why are human beings different from animals?
More attention. Attention.
Yeah, go ahead.
Consciousness.
What were you saying, Jeanette?
We pay attention to more things.
Okay, we pay attention to more things. All right.
Consciousness.
Consciousness. Okay. We have thought,
We're hypnotizing.
feelings.
Emotions.
Well, if you open your packet, there's a quote at the beginning of your packet where Frederick Engels, the founder of scientific socialism, gave his explanation of what separated humanity from animals. Does someone want to volunteer to read that first quote?
In class 1?
Yes, on class 1.
That's the first paragraph?
Yes.
Oh,
Go ahead, Gabby.
but all the planned action of all animals has never succeeded in impressing the stamp of their will upon the earth. That was left for man. In short, the animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends, masters it. This is the final essential distinction between man and other animals. And once again, it is labor that brings about this distinction.
So what Frederick Engels is saying there is that with our labor power, we reinvent the environment. Other animals just interact with their environment, and they interact with it, but we force the environment to serve us. We master it, and we're constantly reinventing the way in which we master our environment to be more and more efficient. And I always say this, I pointed out, ants have been making their ant farms the same way for thousands and thousands of years. And bees have been making their beehives the same way for thousands and thousands of years. And beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for thousands and thousands of years. But in just a few thousand years, 8,000 years, we've gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones. We have the ability to reinvent our relationship with nature in a way that no other species does. And our life expectancy has doubled and tripled in the history of humanity. And our population has greatly expanded. And that is what is unique about mankind. What human history really is it's a progression that as we reinvent the way we interact with our environment, we've gone through multiple stages of human history. The majority of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. We had hunter-gatherer civilization. Right? Hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers, we gathered fruits and nuts, and we lived in tribes of like 20 to 30 people, and we gathered fruits and nuts, and we hunted animals, and that's how we lived. But what happened? We got too good at it.
Right.
We developed spears to kill the animals. We developed rocks to kill the animals with. We got really good at knowing the patterns of plant life. We got so good at hunting and gathering. We were so good at our method of acquiring food and surviving that there was a scarcity. There was the first ecological crisis, right? The first climate catastrophe happened thousands of years ago. And how did we get out of it? With the dawn of agriculture, we made land into private property, and we started growing our own crops, growing our own food, domesticating animals, and that gave rise to a higher mode of production called slavery, right? In the system of slavery that existed in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, you had people who owned the land and owned other people, and you had people that were owned by others, and they were called slaves, and that was the system that existed in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt, that existed in ancient Rome. But slavery is a very inefficient way of doing things. Why? What motivation does a slave have to work? Not much, right? Not much, right? He's just working to avoid punishment. And the more slaves you get, the less and less efficient slavery becomes. So after a while, they figured out that rather than having slaves, they would have what were called serfs. And the serf would have his own little piece of land, and he would grow his crops on his piece of land. He would take care of his animals, and he would then give to the landowner, his rent or his tax, and then he got to keep what was left over. So out of slavery, we got an even higher system of production. And out of slavery, we got feudalism. And feudalism is where the serf owns his piece of land, the serf or the peasant owns their piece of land, and they pay their tax, and they're obligated to this landlord, but they get to keep what's left over, and it's more efficient than slavery. And starting in the 1400s, the 1500s, Europe in particular started changing for a lot of reasons. Number one, there was a lot of trade coming in from Asia. Marco Polo had gone to Asia. You had the Silk Road, and they were bringing in different silks and different products from Asia. You also had an Asian invention called the printing press that was invented. The printing press was first developed on the Korean peninsula, but they had it in China, and they were printing paper currency in China, and Marco Polo brought the idea of the printing press, and eventually in Germany you had a guy named Johannes Gutenberg who developed his own printing press and started printing the Bible. And suddenly people could start printing and reading things, and you had the printing press. And you had the rise of merchants that were engaging international trade, and you had peasants that were revolting and were angry about their conditions. You had the peasant wars, and all of that combined into the rise of the system that we now have, which is the system of capitalism. What's up, Jeanette?
I just want to know what kind of slaves did y'all have back in those 1840s? You talking about Afro-Americans or all nationalities?
Well, the slavery that existed in America was capitalism with slavery. But slavery as an economic system is different. That's what they had in ancient Greece and Rome. Those slaves were producing crops that were sold, right? The British Empire bought the cotton for their textile mill. Yeah, that was capitalism in America with slavery, right? It wasn't the economic system of slavery that they had in ancient Rome. It's important to point out that capitalism, this system, began with what's called primitive accumulation, which is theft on a mass scale. We've always been told that the richest people, they just work the hardest. They're just hard workers, right? In feudalism, right, every peasant has a place on the land and all of that. But in capitalism, the land is private property. And so capitalism began with mass theft. And that's the important thing to remember, because we're always told that the richest people, they all just worked so hard to get what they have. First, they stole it in Europe. And they stole the land from the peasants and the feudal commons. And they seized the land. What?
Who were the peasants?
The peasants were the people who worked on the land.
What kind of people?
They were people who lived in the country, right? If you have a feudal system where you have a landowner who owns the land, and then you have the people who work on the land, they have a piece of the land, and they give some of what they produce to the landowner, and they keep some of...
Pretty much, other than the landowners.
Yeah.
So very few people own the land.
Yeah, and when feudalism was being ripped apart, and they were creating capitalism, it involved mass theft on a massive scale. First in Europe, and then they began colonizing Africa and colonizing the Americas, killing the Native Americans, the transatlantic slave trade where millions of people died on their way to the United States. It was mass theft. And that's what's called primitive accumulation. Out of the primitive accumulation, we got the system of capitalism. And I'm very careful to use this word capitalism nowadays because that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Yeah, what do people think capitalism means? What's the definition of capitalism? What is capitalism? Okay, it's real estate.
Owning the means of production.
Owning the means of production, okay.
Profit, the profit is in demand.
Right. Right, capitalism is the system of profit in command. It's when the means of production are being operated for profit. I think Engels, he calls it, he said, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning they didn't build this house because somebody needed a place to have a class. They built this house because somebody had to make a profit from it. We don't get food. Yeah, we don't have food so people can eat it. We have food so that someone can make a profit from selling it. Profit is in command. That's capitalism, right? And there's a lot of confusion about what capitalism means because a lot of people think capitalism just means having money. Well, there was money in ancient Rome in the slave system. There was money in feudalism, and there's money in socialist countries today, right? There's all kinds of systems with money. Some people think capitalism just means inequality. Well, there's inequality throughout history, and there's going to be mass inequality until there's enough for everybody. Until you have vast abundance, there's always going to be inequality. Capitalism is not inequality. Capitalism is not having money. Capitalism is profits in command. Like you said, owning the means of production, right? The banks, the factories, the centers of economic power are privately owned, and they're operated to maximize profit for those who own it, right? And they operate it for that purpose. And capitalism has been through 4 stages. And the first stage is what I just discussed, the primitive accumulation, the mass theft that created capitalism. It's called primitive accumulation. And that was where the land, all the wealth of the world was turned into private property through an act of mass theft. Yeah, the Native Americans, they'd lived here, they had no problem. It was stolen from them, right? The indigenous people in Africa were stolen and taken to the United States, and millions of them died in the process. It's primitive accumulation. It was in order to create the wealth of the modern capitalist system, there had to be mass theft all over the world. And all the...
What we're trying to get at is like the Comanches and the Apaches and the Wampanoags, whatever, they were fighting each other for the land. As one tribe became bigger, then they had to steal the land from another tribe to sustain their own growth, especially the Comanches. So isn't that primitive accumulation, just like the Ottomans, right?
But they weren't turning the land into private property because they were hunter-gatherers, right? They weren't growing crops on the land. They weren't privately owning the land. They were just kind of had territory in which they hunted and gathered. So it's not the same kind of ownership. Right, but yeah, there were rivalries among different Native American groups, and actually, the Aztecs had a very similar system to the Roman Empire. If you look at the Aztecs, it's the Roman Empire in Mexico, basically. And I mean, instead of having a coliseum where they had people fight each other, they had the human sacrifices at the top, and they had slavery, and it was the same kind of economic system. And basically, the slave system of the Roman Empire existed in Mexico at the time that the Spanish came, and that the Aztecs, had a similar economic system, and they had developed, the slave mode of production already, right? And that the Native American tribes fighting each other for, like, we can hunt in this area, you can't. It's not the same thing as the colonizers coming and kicking all the people out of there and saying, this is our property now, we're going to use it to extract, to make profits growing crops, etc. It's a little bit different. right? But yeah, there was not primitive accumulation because they weren't really turning the land into private property, so to speak. They were kind of using it as territory. That would be my explanation.
Caleb,
Yes.
I have a question. This is something I've always wondered about, like when we transform into capitalism.
Yeah.
So like you justify that it was good to go from feudalism to capitalism, as it will be good to go to capitalism to socialism. At what point is it okay to believe capitalism needs to be there and not advance into socialism? Like, how do you know when to advance into socialism and to keep capitalism?
Well, I think that we can all acknowledge the way capitalism was created was very bloody and violent and involved all kinds of murder and crimes against humanity.
Production, when it advances, is bloody and murder.
You could argue that, but I think it's the reason that it's important to point out capitalism began with mass theft is because of the lie that they worked so hard to get it, right? Which is what we're all told. We're all told the rich people just worked so hard and they're just so smart, but it was not democratic, it was not fair, it was not legal, it was criminal the way that they acquired the land of the world. And I think that's the important point. And also, it's important to point out that it wasn't bloodless, right? Because we hear that socialism is this violent system, it's killed millions of people. In order to just create capitalism, you had genocide on a massive scale. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, there's one thing that I don't think we're addressing yet, and that we give Columbus a lot of credit for discovering the New World, so to speak. But, right after that, Magellan, or actually not the person of Magellan, but his crew, managed to go all the way around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Magellan himself actually found another crew and went himself all the way around the world. All of a sudden, the reality of the world being round dawns on people. They thought it was flat, and maybe it goes off a cliff over there, or maybe it just goes on forever. The world is round means the world is finite. There's only so much land, and only so much water, and only so many islands, and all the rest of it, and you better put your flags out there. And so this really dawns more on Europe than anybody else, and they go out and start being imperialists.
I'm just getting a water. I'm listening. Go ahead.
They start colonizing. Now, I think that mankind has always been pretty bloody, but I think that reality, that there's only so much land, only so much resources, we have some primitive arithmetic, if you want. All you have to do is do the multiplication in 1500 and realize there's going to be too many people. And that I forget the guy that comes up that talks about, you bring him up a lot.
Oh, Malthus. We're going to talk about that.
Malthusians
Yeah.
comes along, and
But there's still a lot of empty land, though.
Yeah.
well, there's still a lot of empty land, yeah, but the world is finite.
Yeah.
The world is finite. That's a big deal to an expansionist thinking. And so you've got to go out there and colonize and make that land yours.
It's also just the realization that there's a certain amount, like it does, like you said, it's finite. It's not necessarily even like they understand how much is there, just they found out that it is finite.
It's finite.
So
And once you get that, it's kind of, that scarcity mindset kicks in.
yeah, out of primitive accumulation, we get the second stage of capitalism, which is called industrialization. Right?
That's when you build.
Industrialization. And industrialization is the mode where you start having factories, right? You have factories, means of production. And you have some people who own the factories, they're the capitalists, and you have some people who work in the factories, the wage workers, the proletarians. And their society begins to divide pretty solidly between the wage worker and the factory owner. And industrialization led to a problem that had never existed before in human history. And that is hunger caused by an abundance of food. That is homelessness caused by an abundance of housing. Poverty created by abundance. And that has never existed until this time. But economists call it glut. G-L-U-T, glut. Right? Where you can have a situation where there's so much oil that people are losing their jobs in the oil industry, and all oil workers lose their jobs. It's a situation where there's so much housing, like in 2008, that you have homeless encampments being set up all over the country. People are losing their houses because there's so much of it. And this had never existed before. Poverty created by abundance. And right now in America they tell us there's a housing shortage. There's no housing shortage. There's loads of housing in this country.
I
Right?
got something to say about that.
Yeah.
I got something to say about that. Like, for instance, like I look at all these encampments that happen in Minneapolis. It's ridiculous. I mean, the government, y'all would like to rather collect a check on the streets than to have a place to lay your head. That's not right.
I mean, the bottom line is there's room for everybody, but it's greed that's like,
Yeah.
And then some people
the
don't even want to go to
capitalists
that
that own
house.
everything
That pisses me off when I see stuff
would rather
like
have
that.
an empty house than
Yeah.
to have a poor person living
For
in it.
real.
Yeah. The way this problem works is it's based on a problem of this system of industrialization, industrial capitalism. When you have factory workers and you have factory owners, it leads to a problem that is intrinsic in this. Now, and I'm going to do some mathematics here, but this is important. So let's say you're making tires. Let's say you have a factory that makes tires. Well, what are you going to need? You're going to need rubber for the tires, right? And you're going to need to ship the tires to where they're sold. But you're also going to need human labor power to assemble the tires. So we're going to call the rubber, the material for the tires, we're going to call that A. Right? That'll be the first cost that the manufacturer has to do. Then, obviously, you're going to ship the tires to wherever they're going to be sold. That'll be B. And then the labor power of the people that you hire to actually assemble those tires, that's going to be C. Right? And so the shipping plus the material, I guess the material plus the shipping and the human labor power, all of that is going to add up to D, which is the final cost, what it costs. Except, well, there's something missing. You have to make a profit. You have to make a profit on it. Well, you can't change how much the material costs, and you can't change how much the shipping costs. So in order to make a profit off of selling your tires, the only place you extract value, you have to cut into the value produced by the worker, right? And that's when people talk about exploitation, right? The worker puts C, that's the value the worker put into it, but in order for the employer to make a profit, C has to be divided. And C1 is what the worker actually gets paid, and C2 is the profit that's made, right? And the value that is put into it that the capitalist is able to extract to make profits comes from the labor power of the person. So you're not getting the full value of what you produce. But there's a little bit of a problem there, right? It's not simply that it's unfair. And then people say, well, what about the factory owner? He put up the money, right? Doesn't he deserve to get compensated and all that? But you're still missing a very, very important thing, which is that C1 is what the worker actually gets paid. C1 is always going to be less than D. The worker is never paid enough in wages to buy back what he produces. The wages that are paid out in the process of production are never enough to purchase the products that are produced. And that's why you have this problem of glut. We always are producing more products than we are paying out wages to purchase. And that is a built-in problem of capitalist production, is that there's never enough wages paid out to purchase the products that are produced. So this is always there, and this is when they talk about the boom-bust cycle, right? And there's all kinds of things the government does to try and deal with this constant problem. For example, I always point out, in Missouri, you can go to a place called Springfield, Missouri, and in Springfield, Missouri, you can find a cave where they have buried billions of dollars worth of cheese.
Where is that?
It's in Springfield, Missouri. And the U.S. government,
What's the
you can
address?
Google it, the cheese cave in Springfield, Missouri. The U.S. government buys billions of dollars worth of cheese from
you offer
farmers.
that cheese.
The U.S. government buys billions of dollars worth of cheese and buries it in a cave. Why? To keep the price of dairy high enough that the farms don't go out of business. Right? And there's many examples of this, right?
Made that cheesecake.
Yeah. There's many other similar things, right? Where the government buys oranges and drops them in the oceans, right? To keep the price of oranges high enough. And then
That's why you gotta go out sometimes. That's what people do what they do. They got all these little resources and things to give it to us, but we sometimes we don't need it. We need to grow our own sometimes.
What part does Henry Wallace play in all of that? in this
Well,
country?
Henry Wallace, right? He invented the food stamps program, and the food stamps program was invented for farmers because farmers were, having all kinds of products they couldn't sell, and so during the Great Depression, Henry Wallace, who became vice president, was Secretary of Agriculture, developed the food stamps program, and the food stamps is actually a huge subsidy to the farming business. And I believe there was talk of cutting food stamps in the 90s, and there was a protest to keep food stamps, and who paid for it? Kraft. Kraft paid for it because they would sell a whole lot less if they got rid of food stamps, right? And the capitalist mode of production, you have this constant problem of more being produced than wages are paid out to buy it. And that is an inherent problem in the capitalist system. However, there's something that makes it worse, which is technology.
It is.
So
Technology taking over.
the capitalist, right, is constantly trying to pay as little wages as he possibly can.
Think we
Right? So he wants to pay as little as he possibly can because the fewer people he hires, the more money he makes.
Right.
But what's the problem?
That part.
C, that's the people he hires. As C decreases, what also decreases? C2 also decreases because he can only extract his profits from human labor.
Right.
So as he replaces human labor with technology, the amount of profit that he can make on each product is constantly decreasing. So what does he have to do? He has to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit per item. And so whenever there's a great technological leap, you have a great meltdown in the economy. And, in the 1800s, every couple of years, they had what they called a panic, where the stock market would crash and there'd be mass unemployment. And then they invented the Federal Reserve as a mechanism to try and stabilize things. But they continued having panics, and we had World War I. And then after World War I, you had assembly line production. It was invented by Henry Ford and Taylor, and suddenly they were making cars and refrigerators faster than they ever could, and it seemed it was great. It was the Roaring 20s, and they said, Ford has defeated Karl Marx. We've invented this new ultra-efficient capitalism. And then we got the Great Depression. And there was a great economic crisis caused by this problem of overproduction, this problem of the value crisis that we're constantly producing. And the more efficient it gets to produce things, the bigger this problem becomes. And the more they revolutionize technology, the bigger this problem becomes. Go ahead, Carter.
I feel like how the 20s happened is it because the government was cutting off the restrictions that were placed there by the progressives and allowed people to buy things without restrictions, and then you have huge amounts of debts that would just rise. Then it just fell apart because people couldn't pay back those debts by 28, and people were just buying TVs and cars and anything on debt, and it wasn't owned by them. So when
that could have been a factor, right? But that would have been done to deal with this problem to begin with, because that's generally what happens. As you get prices of overproduction, they start legalizing lending because they need people to keep spending.
Their wages aren't high enough to buy the products that are being produced.
But ultimately, the issue was that with technological advancement and with what they called Taylorism, where they were producing in factories very, very efficiently, and with the time study and all of that, they were making products quicker than they ever had, and that leads to this inherent meltdown, this inherent problem. We were talking beforehand, during the Great Depression, one of the first things that Roosevelt did when he took office, it was in a book by Nelson Peary that both of us have read, is they talked about how one of the things they did is they killed half the cows in the country. So this is always there, and this is when they talk about the boom-bust cycle, right? And there's all kinds of things the government does to try and deal with this constant problem. For example, I always point out, in Missouri, you can go to a place called Springfield, Missouri, and in Springfield, Missouri, you can find a cave where they have buried billions of dollars worth of cheese.
What is that?
It's in Springfield, Missouri. And the U.S. government,
what's the
you can
address?
Google it, the cheese cave in Springfield, Missouri. The U.S. government buys billions of dollars worth of cheese from farmers.
that cheese.
The U.S. government buys billions of dollars worth of cheese and buries it in a cave. Why? To keep the price of dairy high enough that the farms don't go out of business. Right? And there's many examples of this, right?
Made that cheesecake.
Yeah. There's many other similar things, right? Where the government buys oranges and drops them in the oceans, right? To keep the price of oranges high enough. And then
that's why you gotta go out sometimes. That's what people do what they do. They got all these little resources and things to give it to us, but sometimes we don't need it. We need to grow our own sometimes.
What part does Henry Wallace play in all of that?
Well, Henry Wallace, right? He invented the food stamps program, and the food stamps program was invented for farmers because farmers were, having all kinds of products they couldn't sell, and so during the Great Depression, Henry Wallace, who became vice president, was Secretary of Agriculture, developed the food stamps program, and the food stamps is actually a huge subsidy to the farming business. And I believe there was talk of cutting food stamps in the 90s, and there was a protest to keep food stamps, and who paid for it? Kraft Kraft paid for it because they would sell a whole lot less if they got rid of food stamps, right? And the capitalist mode of production, you have this constant problem of more being produced than wages are paid out to buy it. And that is an inherent problem in the capitalist system. However, there's something that makes it worse, which is technology.
It is.
So
Technology taking over.
the capitalist, right, is constantly trying to pay as little wages as he possibly can.
You think we
Right? So he wants to pay as little as he possibly can because the fewer people he hires, the more money he makes.
Right.
But what's the problem?
That part.
C, that's the people he hires. As C decreases, what also decreases? C2 also decreases because he can only extract his profits from human labor.
Right.
So as he replaces human labor with technology, the amount of profit that he can make on each product is constantly decreasing. So what does he have to do? He has to churn out even more products because he's making less and less of a profit per item. And so whenever there's a great technological leap, you have a great meltdown in the economy. And, in the 1800s, every couple of years, they had what they called a panic, where the stock market would crash and there'd be mass unemployment. And then they invented the Federal Reserve as a mechanism to try and stabilize things. But they continued having panics, and we had World War I. And then after World War I, you had assembly line production. It was invented by Henry Ford and Taylor, and suddenly they were making cars and refrigerators faster than they ever could, and it seemed it was great. It was the Roaring '20s, and they said, Ford has defeated Karl Marx. We've invented this new ultra-efficient capitalism. And then we got the Great Depression. And there was a great economic crisis caused by this problem of overproduction, this problem of the value crisis that we're constantly producing. And the more efficient it gets to produce things, the bigger this problem becomes. And the more they revolutionize technology, the bigger this problem becomes. Go ahead, Carter.
I feel like how the 20s happened is it because the government was cutting off the restrictions that were placed there by the progressives, and it allowed people to buy things without restrictions, and then you have huge amounts of debts that would just rise. Then it just fell apart because people couldn't pay back those debts by 28, and people were just buying TVs and cars and anything on debt, and it wasn't owned by them. So when
that could have been a factor, right? But that would have been done to deal with this problem to begin with, because that's generally what happens. As you get prices of overproduction, they start legalizing lending because they need people to keep spending.
Their wages aren't high enough to buy the products that are being produced.
But ultimately, the issue was that with technological advancement and what they called Taylorism, where they were producing in factories very, very efficiently, with the time study and all of that, they were making products quicker than they ever had, and that leads to this inherent meltdown, this inherent problem. We were talking beforehand, during the Great Depression, one of the first things that Roosevelt did when he took office, it was in a book by Nelson Peary that both of us have read, is they talked about how one of the things they did is they killed half the cows in the country. And what was that to do? It was to double the price of beef, because the price of beef was so low and people couldn't afford to buy the beef. And
5 cents a piece.
Yeah, so they sent the government out to kill half the cows in the country and bury them and then put lime on the corpses so no one could dig them up and eat the meat, and that doubled the price of beef as a stimulus to the economy.
That's crazy.
And that's what they tend to do in an economic crisis. It's called degrowth, right?
Yes.
The idea we can reboot the system with mass destruction. And that's why did we have, we had the Great Depression, and then that led to the Second World War, but then why did we have a huge economic expansion in the 50s and 60s? Because they blew off half the world.
Yeah.
Every major city in Europe, every major city in Asia had been destroyed, and as a result, there was a huge amount of growth and expansion. They rebooted the system with mass destruction, right? And this is the way they deal with this problem. It's a constant issue. And in fact, I believe there's a quotation in there about overproduction. I believe there's a Marx quote. Is it in here?
Yes.
Yeah, in these crises, yeah. Someone wants to read the quote. Yeah, in these crises.
I'll do it.
Go ahead.
In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to have been destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. And how does the bourgeoisie How does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On one hand, by enforced destruction of the mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented.
Yeah. And so that last part about getting rid of the means by which crises are prevented, destruction,
Yes.
right? That is the way they resolve these crises, is with mass destruction. And each time they resolve it, it becomes harder to resolve it. It requires more destruction each time to reboot the system. The Great Depression just kept getting worse, and it didn't have a recovery until you had World War II. And the crisis that we're in now is caused by the great technological leaps that we're living under in our time. Artificial intelligence and the computer revolution. And the fact that with 3D printers and AI, you can make products in a way you've never been able to make them before. And that should be great. Self-driving cars should be a great thing. It should be amazing to have self-driving cars, because this job called driving would no longer be necessary.
Yeah,
But in our deeply irrational economic system, self-driving cars would lead to mass unemployment and riots in the streets and hunger. That's not rational. Why should technological advancement, saving labor, lead to poverty? Right? And that is the inherent problem with capitalism. The problem is that capitalism isn't that it's unequal or making people greedy. It creates a situation where humanity's ability to grow and expand is limited by an irrational system where abundance creates poverty. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, you know, back a number of decades ago, what the left or what the labor movement was all about in a lot of ways was shorter work weeks.
Yeah.
And that got over some of this,
Yeah.
you know, because, you know, we got an 8-hour day instead of a 12-hour day.
Sure.
So we didn't have to work so darn hard because we had these wonderful machines that were doing the work for us. But the owners of that stuff were getting all the money for that, and
Yeah.
it was hard to extract higher wages from them. The idea of higher wages for less work just really strikes so many people as ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's really not ridiculous, it just makes sense. But why wouldn't that work again? Does it not work again? Does that, was it ever enough, I guess?
Well, and the labor movement was certainly a correcting force.
Uh-huh.
And we're actually going to get to that in the next stage. So,
Okay,
you
I
know,
was ahead of it. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay.
It's all very important. So, obviously, we're not in the age of industrial capitalism any longer. Around the time of the 1890s, capitalism entered its third stage, which is called imperialism. And what was imperialism? Well, if you're producing all these extra products, you need somebody to buy them. And if you're not paying enough wages out for the workers in your country to buy them, what do? You go and seize someplace in Africa or Asia or Latin America, and you force them to buy your products. And that's what imperialism is. When the British Empire colonized India, the people in India had been weaving for thousands of years. But when they got to India, they burned down all the looms, and they forced them to import their cloth from Britain so that the British textile mills could not have a problem of overproduction. And there's many examples of this, right? More recent example is NAFTA, and what NAFTA's done in
Yeah.
Mexico.
Yes.
People in Mexico have been growing their own food since the time of Christopher Columbus. But with NAFTA, the Mexican farmers have been forced under, and now they have to buy their products from the American agribusiness corporations. And imperialism is a mechanism for trying to deal with the built-in problem of overproduction. If you can seize parts of the world as captive markets, if you can force them to buy your products, if you can prevent them from developing their own industries and their own manufacturing and make them client states where they have to purchase from you, you can dominate the world. And that's called imperialism. What's interesting is the American Revolution had a lot to do with this economic system. What was the American Revolution about? It was about the fact that the people living in the 13 colonies wanted their own industries, and they wanted their own economy in the United States. And the British said, no, we just want to dump our products on you. We want to make you buy our tea. We want to make you buy our products. No, you can't have your own industries. So the colonists, what do? They went and dumped the tea in the harbor, and you had the American Revolution. And there were different sides to the American Revolution. There was the slave plantation system in the South. There was the industrialists in the North. There were the farmers. But basically the fight in the American Revolution was, do we want to have our own industries and our own economy, or do we just want to exist as a captive market for the British Empire? And that was the question in the American Revolution. And actually, there's a quotation from one of the most important economists, an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. It's on the next page here. It starts, "Two systems are before the world." So, does someone want to read?
I'll read it.
Go ahead, Kenny.
Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupy desert tracts, the sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men by millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city that shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid of contributions, which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other to concentration, by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land, and the farmer and planter shall be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce, the other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level, the other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised. Is that correct?
Keep
The
going.
other one that ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating which. Somebody read that sentence for me. I can't.
While equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is true mission of the people of these United States. Henry Charles Carey, 1856.
Yeah, and that was Henry Charles Carey, who was an economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And he was arguing that Alexander Hamilton's economic theories about having a national bank that funded industries was contrary to the British Empire and the way they were holding back development around the world. And so, carrying on the tradition of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Charles Carey wrote about the American system versus the English system.
But why did that happen, though?
What's that?
Why did that happen? That sounds good.
Well, yeah, well...
That's a good question.
Yeah. You can also, and then if you go to the page before, Lenin observed the same thing. Lenin observed capitalism moving into its monopolistic, imperialistic stage. Do you want to read the quote before that on the page beforehand about how capitalism became imperialism? Yeah.
Which one? This here?
Yeah. There we go.
Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. Its specific character is threefold. Imperialism is the monopoly of capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, and moribund capitalism. The supplanting of the free competition by monopoly is a fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 principal forms. Number 1, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree where it gives rise to these monopolistic associations of capitalists. Number 2, the monopolistic position of the big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economic life in America, France, and Germany. And number 3, seizures of the source of raw material by the trust and the financial oligarchy. Financial capital is a monopoly in industrial capital merged with bank capital. And then number 4, the economic partition of the world by international cartels has begun. There are already over 100 such international cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably, that's funny, among themselves until it redivides it. The export of capital as distinct from export of commodities under a non-monopoly capitalism is highly characteristic phenomenon and is closely linked with the economic and territorial political partition of the world. 5. The territorial partition of the world colonies is completed. So we just want world domination now.
Yeah, and so the big aspect of what makes imperialism distinct from industrialization is that in imperialism, bankers rule rather than factory owners. Now, what's the difference between a banker and a factory owner?
A factory owner is producing things.
Right.
Yeah.
A banker is just collecting interest.
Yeah, he's just making money by having money.
The factory owner has a purpose of wanting growth. He loves growth. That's what he's about. Well, the banker wants to hold down growth and then use captive markets to not grow economies of the global south, just so they can pump the markets full of cheap goods. While the industrialist says, no, I want everyone to grow because I want them to buy my shit. He doesn't have like this degrowth mindset, really.
Right.
It's only the
Imperialism is about holding back economic development. During this period, capitalists, they couldn't do it because of the problems of capitalism, but they wanted growth. The imperialists don't want growth. They want to keep people in Africa impoverished. They want to keep Latin America a place with a low life expectancy and low living conditions. They're about holding back growth. We also talked about the seizure of raw materials, right? What is the top oil exporting country in Africa? Nigeria. And the life expectancy in Nigeria is quite low. And the rate of adult illiteracy is quite high. And the infant mortality rate is quite high.
But their education is something else over there, though, too.
Well, most of the people in Nigeria don't have access to education. And that's because the oil that they have, it's a hugely wealthy country with a huge amount of oil. That oil is in the hands of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. They don't control their own natural resources. Their natural resources have been seized, right? Whereas what country used to have the highest life expectancy in Africa? It was Libya. Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi. They seized their own oil, and they used it to build up their economy. And they had the highest life expectancy. But now, since 2011, the NATO bombs have destroyed it. And that's what imperialism needs. Imperialism needs war, right? It has to enforce itself, to seize new markets, to beat down competitors, to make sure those countries don't start developing and having their own industries. You have to enforce it with war. So when he talks about the international financial oligarchy and the export of capital, what's the export of capital? Well, under the industrialization, you exported tires. But under imperialism, you export Firestone, the tire manufacturing company that goes all over the world. The corporation goes all over the world rather than just the products being sold on an international market. The export of capital. And that's called imperialism. And one necessary part of imperialism, and you were talking about this, is labor reformists and labor leaders. Because they make sure you can have stability in the homeland. You have to have the people in the homeland that are willing to wave the flag and go to the war. Right, and support all the wars, and so you have to have a layer of people that are well fed, that have a nice, comfortable house and car, and have a level of comfort that will make them loyal to empire, and that's called the aristocracy of labor, right? And starting in the 1890s, all the socialists and labor leaders in the Western countries stopped being revolutionary and started becoming big supporters of imperialism, because imperialism needed an aristocracy of labor. It needed labor union bosses. It needed ways to get the working people to be loyal to empire. And we talk about that big middle class, that American white middle class that was so conservative in McCarthyism. That's called the aristocracy of labor, and that having a layer of workers that are loyal to the imperialists and will help them beat down and impoverish countries, that's what is distinct about imperialism. You couldn't have imperialism without fake socialist parties, without fake labor leaders, without the Labor Party in Britain, without the Democrats in the United States, without the corrupt union bosses that run the AFL-CIO. You couldn't have imperialism. You need to give one section of the population enough crumbs that they will support the wars and that they will align with their bosses against the people in the colonized world. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there just had been a division between AFL-CIO for a while. That was kind of along these lines, I think.
Well, I argue that we're now entering stage number 4.
Okay,
so,
let's go.
do you want to read the last quote that is on there?
Yep.
It's from Rosa Luxemburg.
Is it the world war is a regression?
Yes. Yeah, this is from World War I. Rosa Luxemburg was a German woman who was against World War I, and she was thrown in prison for opposing World War I. She was a socialist, and she saw that all the socialists and labor union bosses in Germany were supporting the war, and she opposed it. So she wrote a pamphlet, and she couldn't even put it out under her own name. It was called the Junius Pamphlet. And she just distributed it everywhere, calling out the socialist labor leaders for supporting World War I. They eventually figured out she wrote it, and they threw her in prison. And in her pamphlet, in the first chapter, she said the following about World War I.
This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of a modern war. But then, when the period of unlimited wars begin, it progresses towards the inevitable consequences. The triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization. As ancient Rome, depopulation, desolation, degeneration, and a great cemetery. Rosa Luxemburg, 1914.
So
that's
this
where
is-
we're at now.
Yeah, World War I, she's saying this war, World War I, this was the most atrocious war that had ever happened. It had poison gas that was used. It had machine guns that were widely used. There had been machine guns before, but never on that level before. It had, the first time you saw airplanes used in war and bombing. And she's watching this war, and she's saying this is European civilization coming apart, right? And she said first it'll happen sporadically. You'll have World War I, you'll have World War II. But eventually the system of imperialism is going to need war constantly. And when we get to the point that we have constant war, the homeland is going to rip apart. And we're ultimately going to see the collapse of civilization. And she compared it to the fall of Rome. Because was the fall of the Roman Empire a good thing?
No.
No. I mean, the Roman Empire was awful. We're not defenders of the Roman Empire. But what replaced it? Something worse. Chaos. Barbarism, instability, the life expectancy went down by 5-6 years. It took Europe approximately 1,100 years to get the population level up to what it was. The average human height went down because the Roman Empire was this brutal empire, but it was replaced with instability and chaos. And Rosa Luxemburg is arguing that just like the Roman system, it led to constant war, it ultimately collapsed from within and deteriorated into barbarism, that the imperialist economic system will do the same thing. And I would argue that she's correct and that we've entered stage number 4. Because you'll notice that labor aristocracy isn't there anymore. Those white picket fences homes, they've been foreclosed. They're owned by banks now. And those families that used to be prosperous middle-class families across America are straddled with student debt. And how are the corporations making profits? It used to be they made profits by having a car factory that sold cars, or having a steel mill that made steel. Now they make profits by getting people addicted to opioids and pushing doctors to overprescribe opioid medications. Is that producing value? Of course not.
Blame it on Mexican immigrants.
Oh, and what else do? They
USA.
have prisons for profit. Locking people in prison is the way they're making profit. Now, are you adding value to your society when you lock people in prison in order to make profits for corporations? Of course not. Right? And we've entered this period where the only way the system can continue to go is through accumulation of destruction. I guess I'll call it destructive accumulation.
Get people locked up.
Right. Destructive accumulation. Whether it's destroying countries around the world in constant wars,
Or cities and states.
or destroying people over here and destroying the economy, we've entered a period where they're not making profit from economic growth, they're making profit through destruction. And the imperialist homelands, instead of building up a prosperous aristocracy of labor in the homeland, they're imploding the economy here at home. And this is what we're living in, right? This is the ultimate result of having a system of profits and demand. Well, what do we need? Ultimately, we need profit to not be in command. We need the state to organize the economy to make sure that it keeps growing. We need a government of action that fights for working families. Ever since we started CPI, that's been the slogan. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government that represents the people to control the economy, to make sure that growth continues, and to beat back the power of the big imperialist monopolies. And that's what we ultimately need, and that's the vision. We are fighting with a 4-point economic plan for a government of action that fights for working families. And we're going to talk in the next section about what that would mean, but I think we should just take a break and maybe go around and reflect on what we're talking about, because we argue that capitalism and imperialism has entered this stage of destructive accumulation. And that's what separates us, because if you listen to other people nowadays, I said at the beginning, we don't even call ourselves communists at this point. We don't use that label anymore because You know, the communists all came out here to protest us today, right? They don't like us. And if you listen to communists, they're talking about, they're stuck here. They're talking about workers and bosses and, you know, shouldn't we have democratic worker councils or whatever? Or they're trying to get into the labor bureaucracy and then voting for the Democrats, and they're mad that Donald Trump might not start the wars that imperialism needs and is too friendly to Russia. We're doing something different because we argue that this is the stage that capitalism has entered, the stage of destructive accumulation. And based on that, it creates the necessity for creating a government of action. So why don't we just kind of go around and reflect on this, and then we'll continue. So go ahead,
Didn't
Gavin.
Lenin talk about that? Like they hired like the upper class people, and they hired them to just get everything comfortable, so they could like be the socialists of running things.
Looks like the
But they're like they're the ones that take over the fake socialist group. But even Lenin was talking about that.
Yeah, World War I would never have happened if it hadn't been for a bunch of socialist leaders who'd said they believed in peace and promised they would never support a war, at the last minute supported
They
it.
get paid, you know.
Yeah.
They get a
Well,
good check.
And there's no way that nowadays the U.S. government would get away with spending billions and billions of dollars on Ukraine while our country's getting poorer and poorer if it wasn't for labor union bosses and Democratic Party leaders that claim to be for the people, that claim to advocate free healthcare and all of that, that lead them to do it. Fake socialists are an essential part of the imperialist system. There's no question about it, absolutely.
Yeah, Lenin talks about it. With
Yeah.
your book that you wrote, so I liked it. And then we talk about CPI afterwards. So that's what we need to exist. So
Yeah. But go ahead, let's reflect on this a bit before we get to the next part. Any other thoughts?
And we were talking about how, like, back in, like, the 50s during, like, industrialization, remember, like, back then when, like, refrigerators and, like, just different stuff, like, lasted for, like, a long time, and then you see where we're at now, and you can't,
gotta
like,
buy a
keep
new
a
one
TV.
every other year.
Yeah, for,
Oh
like, 10
boy,
years,
you're really
as soon as, so that's, like, also could be, like, under destructive accumulation because we're constantly having to use our money to buy these frivolous things because nothing even lasts anymore.
And also, the
I love
rate of
that.
profit that they make
That they need to
has gone down, so they have to sell
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
They can't make the same amount of profit on each one because of this
Look,
problem.
there's less labor going into each
Yes.
one.
Right,
It's
right.
automated. There's the thing that we have finite as human beings is time.
Yes.
And when we put our labor towards something, that puts value towards it. So if we're not working on the thing, if a machine is doing it, we're off doing anything else and enjoying ourselves maybe, or not. Doesn't really matter. The fact is there's less value going into the thing. So the thing has to cost less. So, same time, we still keep having the C2, C1 problem, where C1 is still part of what's going out.
Right.
So less and less and less and less and less is being paid out, and more and more and more and more is being made. It's got to be shittier.
And like I said, I work for Target, so I see it like all the time. People call and their warranties up. Like back then, there used to be like 10-year warranties on a dishwasher, but now it's like, hey, you have 90 days to program.
Yeah, exactly. You go through the thing.
Yeah.
There's not even a person that checks you out anymore. There's a screen, and it's like, do you want the 3 months of protection?
Right.
Yeah, we're in
Go ahead, Penny.
Okay, so I have a story. It's related to this, but it's kind of indirect. So I was reading a book about a guy who went to a Southeast Asian island to study, to try to do ecological restoration protection thing for like plants that were going extinct, and he got grants from this museum and rich people and all that. So when he was there, in his journey to find this remote place in the mountains to find these crazy plants, and he had all kinds of adventures with people that were trying to scam him for money because he's American, and the Americans during World War II, and they had money. But one thing that he discovered is that after World War II, they left a lot of the military equipment behind, and the locals buried it, right? And then from time to time they pull it out of the ground and they use the steel for their roofs because the quality of the steel that was left behind during World War II is like 100 times better than any steel on the market
Oh,
now.
that's a good point. Yeah, wow.
So kind of a weird roundabout way, but yeah.
Anyone else want to make a comment? Okay, go ahead, Carter.
Yeah.
Oh, I think, did Jeanette, do you? Okay, go ahead, Carter. Go
No,
ahead.
not right now.
Your little how you're explaining how the socialists were forced us into World War I, the German. the SPD, the Socialist Party of Germany, was extremely. I
Ah,
mean, they were very popular. I mean, they had the power to do it. It's not like they were some subtle party. I'm pretty sure they were leading the government.
Yes.
And I feel like World War I, that's when we should have all said, the so-called left should have said, what's the point of these bourgeois socialist parties? But yet they're still being promoted today. I mean, the SPD is in power as we speak. It's crazy that, like, there's still people making excuses for them. World War I was the test, and they failed. I mean, they failed in, 1914?
Yeah.
Why are they even
Well,
still...
the Labour Party is in power in Britain today. And they said that if Donald Trump cuts off the war in Ukraine, they're going to keep funding it. And they're the Socialist Party in Britain. I mean, they're an essential part of it. And actually, the next quote that we have, this kind of is a segue into the next quote if you turn the page. We have a very quote. So this is from Vladimir Lenin calling out the fake socialists of his time. Maybe you can read it, Carter.
Give me a second.
Where are we?
I think we're in the
Which one
third
is it?
page.
Neither we nor anyone else.
Yeah, neither we nor anyone else. Yeah.
Neither we nor anyone else can calculate precisely what portion of the proletariat is following and will follow the social chauvinists and opportunists. This will be revealed only by the struggle. It will be definitely decided only by the socialist revolution. But we know for certain that the defenders of the fatherland in the imperialist war represent only a minority. And it is therefore our duty, if we wish to remain socialists, to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. This is the whole meaning and the whole purport of the struggle against opportunism. By exposing the fact that the opportunists and social chauvinists are in reality betraying and selling the interests of the masses, that they are defending the temporary privileges of a minority of workers, that they are vehicles of the bourgeois ideas and influences, that they are really allies and agents of the bourgeoisie, we teach the masses to appreciate their true political interests, to fight for socialism and for the revolution through all the long and painful
Vicissitudes.
of the imperialist wars and imperialist armistice.
Yeah.
Armistice is a peace deal.
Yeah. And so that was Lenin, the founder of the Bolshevik Party, that led the Russian Revolution. And he was basically saying that the socialist movement are my enemies. And he actually used a different name. They were calling themselves socialists and social democrats. And in Russia, the war was very unpopular. A lot of working people didn't want to fight in it. And the Tsar was viewed as incompetent, and the Tsar was overthrown. There was a mass uprising, the Tsar was overthrown. And after the Tsar was overthrown, the debate became, do we want to continue fighting in the war or not? And Lenin was the anti-war guy, and his party were called the Bolsheviks. They were against the war. And so when he got back to Russia, after the Tsar was overthrown, he said we have to call ourselves the Communist Party rather than the Socialist Party, because we don't want anyone to confuse us with the party that is leading people off to war. And he said, we're the Communist Party now, we're different than the Socialist Party, and we are going to focus on opposing the war. And then they were successful, and they had a revolution, and they overthrew the Tsarist system, they overthrew capitalism in Russia, and they created the Bolshevik Revolution. And when they created the Russian Revolution, one of the first things they did is they called a conference in what's now called Azerbaijan, in Baku. And that was called the Congress of the Peoples of the East. And at that conference, they said, we will work with anyone who is fighting the imperialists. Doesn't matter who you are. And in fact, one of the most conservative, right-wing, traditional guys around at the time was the Emir of Afghanistan. And they said, we will support the Emir of Afghanistan because he's fighting the British Empire. And any fight against the colonizers is a good fight. They also supported the Egyptian merchants and the Egyptian capitalists that were fighting the British Empire. And a number of black revolutionaries around the world were inspired by what the Bolsheviks were doing, organizing. They said, we'll work with anyone who opposes the imperialists. And if you support imperialism, we don't care what you call yourself. You can call yourself a socialist or a communist or an anarchist or a dentist. If you're supporting the imperialists, we don't support you. The fight is against imperialism. That's what it's all about. Peter, do you want to read the quotes from Stalin, Foundations of Leninism, about the Emir of Afghanistan? Go ahead.
Yeah. The struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. The struggle that the Egyptians, or the Egyptian merchants and bourgeois intellectuals are waging for the independence of Egypt is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the bourgeois origin and bourgeois title of the leaders of Egyptian national movement, despite the fact they are opposed to socialism. Stalin, the foundations of Leninism.
Yeah. So he's saying, look, we will support anyone who's opposing the imperialists. And on top of that, we are opposed to the imperialist system, and no matter what, even if you call yourself a socialist while you do it, or you espouse progressive values, and we see that much more in our time than before. When we invaded Afghanistan, that was to liberate the women. Remember, it was to protect the women. We just cared so much about those Afghan women. Well, for 20 years, the USA occupied Afghanistan, and the conditions for the Afghan women did not get any better. And after 20 years of wrecking the country and the heroin gangs setting up shop and ISIS and all those groups getting stronger, the USA pulled out of Afghanistan. And at no point in the 20 years did it get stable. I know there's a lot of people here that are from Somalia, right? And in this city that, from their background. Has Somalia gotten any better? How many times has the USA sent troops to Somalia? How many times? The USA has bombed Somalia. There's soldiers in Somalia. There's drone strikes in Somalia. Has it gotten any better?
No.
Yeah.
It's worse over here too.
Yeah, look at Iraq.
Yes.
Iraq. We're told Saddam Hussein was just such a bad guy. He was such an evil dictator. Is Iraq any better since the USA invaded? Not at all.
No.
Yeah, and Libya used to have the highest life expectancy in Africa until the USA went in there. They don't make these countries better, right? And that anyone who is resisting the imperialists is on the right side, and anyone who's supporting the imperialists, even if they do it in the name of the rainbow flag and LGBT, or they do it in the name of progressive values or whatever, if you're supporting the imperialists, you're on the wrong side. Right, and that was the founding principle upon which the Russian Revolution was established. Go ahead, Carter.
I was gonna. It made me think. I feel like a lot of people think that when imperialism comes to a country, like if they're not trained into, I guess, Leninism, they think that the imperialists will bring development, that they'll bring them up to the higher stage of production, but they want to keep them down. That's the whole point. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that Libya was destroyed. It's not like, well, we had to overthrow Gaddafi and we maybe went too far, but we wanted to help them. No, you guys wanted to prevent development so they could break away from the Western imperialist forces.
Exactly.
That's their entire that's the entire purpose of everything. To keep down development.
Go ahead, Tom.
I just want to point out that I agree with just everything that's been said. But I just want to say that the communists that were out there, honorable people. And what we're talking about, even if we're talking about Stalinists, those people were good, decent people.
Yes.
They cared for me. They loved me.
Right.
All the Christians we're talking about, no, in my neighborhood, they didn't. They hated me.
Yeah.
They beat me up.
Well,
My nose goes that way. They broke my nose with a stick.
wow.
Okay, it gets worse. I won't go further.
Yeah, well, and the McCarthyism that you faced is very similar to the cancel culture of today, right? If
Cancel culture
somebody
is what it is.
dares to oppose U.S. foreign policy, like I've done, their name gets on a list, and it's the same kind of thing.
And rumor
And all kinds
school
of
system knows it.
Yeah.
Police know it.
But that's why, I think North Korea is smart. They won't, we hear, oh my gosh, they're dictators, but they're just trying to keep America from stealing their country. So, I mean, you're almost, safer there than to, let all the chaos into your country, so.
You jumped a corner that you're going to jump eventually. You're going the right direction.
I just wanted to clarify something for everybody who's not as familiar with all these older works.
Yeah.
When Lenin here is talking about social chauvinists, he's specifically talking about people who always put their country first no matter what. Like, in our case, that would be, America is always right, overthrow Libya because America good.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He also talks about opportunists. And
Yes.
another old-timey word. It was people who would constantly change their positions to kind of just be whatever would help them seize the opportunity. And that's, Afghan women are in danger? Well, we'll go protect them. We'll seize the opportunity. Oh, you're against the war in Afghanistan? You must be against women.
Right.
No.
That's what Lenin's talking about in those things.
Yeah.
Those same trends.
Yeah.
we see today.
Putting your own interest above the interests of the revolutionary movement overall is opportunism,
Yeah.
right? that you see an opportunity to align with the enemy and you take it because it'll advance you personally.
Yes.
You don't
Right.
vote for Kamala, you're sexist, you're racist, you're chauvinist, you're homophobic.
But so let's talk about what happened next, because
Kamalophobia.
1917 was a really long time ago. And after the Russian Revolution, they're having all these conferences to organize people around the world. They gave aid to China and Sun Yat-sen and eventually Mao to have their revolution. They gave aid to people in Africa. They gave aid to people in the East and in many places. But what are we always told? I was told in school, communism never worked anywhere. It just always failed. It always failed. Who invented space travel?
Yeah.
Soviet Union.
Russians.
Yeah. Yeah. Who had the biggest steel industry in the world in the 1920s and 30s? It was the Soviet Union. Right? They industrialized, they turned that whole section of the world into an industrial powerhouse. They had never had running water, they'd never had electricity, they'd never had any of that. And with state central planning, they were able to rapidly raise a whole country into being a modern country.
There's some places you could do that at, but not up in America.
Well, and they, during the 1930s when they were doing it, America was having the Great Depression.
You go certain parts of America, you can do that, but you can't do it here.
And they wiped out illiteracy. They built modern universities, and it was quite amazing what they were doing. And actually, I wanted somebody to read, this quote here that explains why they were doing it from Engels, 1848. So go ahead, Tom.
All right.
Yeah.
This is the difference is?
Yes.
Okay. The difference is that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning in the storm and the electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc, the difference between conflagration and fireworking in the service of man. I don't know that I read that in a way that makes sense. The difference is as that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning of the storm and the electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc, the difference between a conflagration and fire working in the service of man. Okay. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. Engels, 1848.
Yeah. So what he's saying there is the difference between capitalism and socialism is like the difference between lightning and this electrical light, right? It's the same kind of energy, but it's concentrated. It's organized so that it can be concentrated right here for our service. And socialism, as the Bolsheviks understood it, was taking the popular power, the energy of the capitalist economy, all this wealth-producing material, and rationally organizing it so you could grow very rapidly in a planned way, which is what the Soviet Union was able to do. And that's what China has been able to do. And that's why China used to be the sick man of Asia, and they've raised 800 million people out of poverty. And they have the fastest trains in the world that go over 250 miles an hour. And they have the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. That's why Cuba has a healthcare system that is considered the greatest in the world. They have the greatest medical system in the world, just besides being a tiny island that the USA has put all kinds of sanctions on and tried to crush them.
You been there?
I have not, but I've met with Cuban doctors. I've been to different places. I've been to Venezuela, another socialist country. I've been to Nicaragua. I haven't been to Cuba though. But yeah, I was supposed to go, and that's a long story. But but if you look at it with central planning, you can rapidly raise a country up. It's about taking the chaos of the market and concentrating it and planning it. And in the 20th century, it was countries that had been under the domination of imperialism, that had been underdeveloped, that seized control of their economies. And with state central planning, they were able to destroy the anarchy of production and concentrate their power and lift their countries up. And that's what the Cold War really was. It wasn't capitalism versus communism. It was countries under the gun of imperialism, breaking free from imperialism with central planning. And that's why Libya had the highest life expectancy in Africa. And there's many examples of this. And of course, whenever these countries broke free, they were attacked. And not all of these countries were led by Marxist-Leninist communists. Revolution of Iran. right? And that's an Islamic system, but they call it not capitalism but Islam, and they have central planning. They had a construction jihad. They have state-run industries, and a popular revolution in the name of Islam took control of the economy. In Ghana, you had Kwame Nkrumah, who is an African leader. He said, I'm not a Marxist, I'm an African socialist, but he centrally planned the economy. You had Arab socialism in Egypt with Abdel Nasser. You had Baathism, which means rebirth or resurrection in Arabic. And in Syria and in Iraq, the government was called the Baathist government, or the rebirth government. And it was a particular form of socialism that they applied to the Arab world, Baathist Arab socialism. And that there are many different ways that countries have adopted central planning and broken out of Western domination. But at the end of the day, if you want to not be under the gun of the imperialists, you kind of have to move towards socialism. There's no way that you can have your economy continue to grow unless you assert control over it and rationally plan it. So every country that's fighting the imperialists, maybe they don't start out wanting to be socialists or have a central plan, but they have to move towards it, right? And that's an important thing that we learned in the 20th century. But the Soviet Union no longer exists. And so why does the Soviet Union no longer exist? Want to share some thoughts? Why does the Soviet Union no longer exist? Why is the Soviet Union gone?
Well, I've always felt that, and maybe you'll correct me on this,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like the West was more able to isolate Russia and, keep them from advancing. Like, if we had said in the 60s, oh, we want to send our jobs over to Russia because that'll give us cheaper profits or something like that,
Yeah.
the story would have turned out differently. Whereas in China, we were kind of seduced by China because capitalists saw, hey, there's money there, we can undercut labor, and so China was able to sort of take a different path because, capitalism plants the seeds of its own destruction by greed.
Well,
So I don't know if that answered your question correctly, but there's a little bit of a difference there that I always felt.
okay. Right, Gabby and then Fatima.
Yeah.
Right.
You said the what?
What?
The question was,
Why does the Soviet Union not exist anymore? Why did the Soviet Union fall?
when you say that, just reminds me when there was a time when McDonald's was in Russia and it kind of messed up everything.
Okay.
That's all I could.
Okay, we can talk about that. Go ahead.
I would think that because, like in Europe, the Soviet Union was, so big and mass, so they had to, destroy it and shrink it down so it's not so massive. So then, the other countries in Europe can be the dominant players.
Yes, you're all pointing to aspects of the truth, right? The Soviet Union was never given a moment of peace. They were never allowed to breathe. From the moment that they started, 15 different countries invaded them. They were blockaded. They were sanctioned. The Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and killed 27 million people. And the USA, had a blockade. You couldn't give them any technology. They had a treaty, the Treaty of Multilateral Controls, where they were blocked from getting access to any of the computer technology that was emerging. They were under sanction. They were locked out of the world economy. They were under threat. They were constantly invaded and attacked, and the USA was funding protest movements to destabilize them. But there was also an issue going on within the Soviet Union, which was the Soviet Union, with central planning, they had a huge steel industry, and they were making huge amounts of steel. And they had a huge oil industry, and they built modern universities, and they wiped out illiteracy and all of that. But they had a problem with what's called consumer goods, right? The stuff that makes life fun, like children's toys, right? Like clothing, shoes, right? And those kinds of things, consumer goods. Central planning isn't so good with consumer goods, or the stuff that makes life fun. When you go to a restaurant, right? You generally, the waiter does a really good job because he wants you to come back and he wants to get a good tip at the end of the day, right? And that hotels, the consumer goods, things that make life fun, the Soviet Union wasn't so good with, and they needed to change. And in the 70s and 80s. The socialist countries of the world were changing because they realized they'd gotten over that first hurdle of industrialization. They'd electrified the country and all of that. But there was still a problem with consumer goods, and so they were starting to adjust. But they had been so rigidly attacked, and they had developed such an authoritarian kind of rigid way of doing things because they were under attack. When they started to change things, the whole thing fell apart, right? Because they couldn't bend, and so they broke. right? And it was a tragedy, but it was a result of everything they'd been subjected to. And it was a result of the fact that when you have consumer products, right? The Soviet Union could make steel just as well as America could. They could make cars just as well as America could. But when it came to, consumer goods, there was a need for some market incentive. So the Soviet Union fell. But China, you'll notice, didn't fall. And China was able to adjust their economy to introduce things. And there's got a quotation here on the next page.
Were China and Russia like friends back then?
Well, they were friends at the beginning, but then in 1961, they parted ways because the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, thought he could make a deal with the United States, where the USA would leave them alone. And so Mao, who was the leader he didn't want to make a deal with the United States. He was more revolutionary. So the USA cozied up to the Soviet Union for a while in the 60s and isolated China. And then, after the Soviet Union realized the USA had stabbed them in the back and tried to overthrow the government of Czechoslovakia, then the USA started cozying up to China and working against the Soviet Union. They played them against each other. And it's interesting because one of the things when Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, his interview with Bill O'Reilly, he said, "You can't have Russia and China together. You can't have Russia and China together. Obama brought Russia and China together. We got to pull them apart," right? And that the USA was constantly trying to pull apart Russia and China because they were two very powerful socialist countries. And so starting in the 1960s, they were divided. And then in the 70s, China started pivoting into the US camp. And China was still a very poor country. They were able to bring in foreign investment through that alliance with the United States, right? But then the USA still tried to overthrow them. And they had the Tiananmen events, 1989, where the USA was still trying to overthrow them. But dividing Russia and China was very important. But in 1980, they started changing China's economy. They called it socialism with Chinese characteristics, where you have private corporations as part of a centrally planned economy. So does someone want to read the second quote on the page here?
Sure.
Go ahead.
The fact that China is poor, has weak economic foundations, and is backward in education, science, and culture means that we have to go through a hard struggle. We want to make use of foreign funds and technology and to actively expand our foreign trade, but we must rely primarily on our own efforts. We are opposed to those absurd reactionary concepts of impoverished socialism, transition in poverty to a higher stage, and making revolution in poverty, touted by Lin Biao and the Gang of Four. But we are also opposed to the idea of turning China into a so-called welfare state right now because that's impossible. We can only improve our standard of living gradually on the basis of expanded production. It is wrong to expand production without raising the people's standard of living, but it is likewise wrong, in fact, impossible, to raise the people's standard of living without expanding production.
So what's he pointing out there is that you can't have equality in poverty. As long as there's not enough to go around, some are going to have and some are going to have not. The basis of creating equality is with abundance. When there's enough for everybody, no one feels a need to hoard, and everyone's pretty much equal.
I stopped that shit a long time ago. I'm glad I don't.
Well, if you look at it, right, the communist countries of the world, they were barricaded and isolated, so many of them fell into the trap of trying to create equal societies in poverty. And that's a recipe for disaster. The Cultural Revolution in China, before Deng Xiaoping, you had the Cultural Revolution. And they were trying to create equality in poverty. And in the early years of the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara tried to create equality in poverty. And there are other examples of this. But the idea that a country can be deeply impoverished, but you'll make everyone equal, that's not reality. The whole point of a centrally planned economy is to raise productive forces so that you can move closer to equality by raising productive forces. But because these countries were isolated and under attack, they tried to have equality in poverty. And that was a disaster. And China realized you can't have impoverished socialism. Go ahead.
They got the best hair over there in China, what's there for Afro-Americans. All that hair, they got the hair. And then we go to Africa, then we go to different countries, they make get hair too.
Oh, really?
The human, like braids and stuff,
Oh.
micros and all that, they got all of that stuff over there.
Wow.
And in the United States, they get that stuff, and then they market prices go up, and then it depends on the merchandise, how it looks.
Yeah, China...
From hair to the food to anything.
Yeah, they're very good at manufacturing because it's a centrally planned economy, right? The government controls the means of production. They have 5-year economic plans. Many of the major industries are run by the state. And the lending of money, the government has a central bank that strategically lends money But there's still private enterprise. People can have their own store, people can have their own business, but there's a government at the center of it, a popular government that came out of an anti-colonial revolution that is planning the economy, is strategically lending money, is stimulating industries. So with a planned economy, they can use the market to create growth. And they got away from the notion of what they called impoverished socialism, trying to make everyone equal in poverty.
When you say
Gray
impoverished socialism, that's more like Cuba.
Well, Cuba's trying to be more like China now. But historically, yes, during the Soviet period, again, it was an economy where everything was run by the government. No private hotels, no private restaurants, you need the market for the things that make life fun, but the market can't be in command. It can't be controlled, right? Yeah, you need a state that represents the people to control the economy.
Some countries, like the United States, you rarely find people like that.
Yeah.
Very rarely.
Well, and actually,
Other countries, same thing too. Because everybody's in their own pocket some pockets these days. And everything's a competition game now these days.
Well, everything's for profit. That's what the problem
And,
is here.
and what's very ironic is that, we're told that capitalism is having your own store, right? It's having your own business. But you'll notice that in China and Nicaragua and communist countries, things are a lot better for small business owners than they are over here. Here we have a government that works with the big monopolies and crushes the small business owners, whereas in Nicaragua... In Nicaragua, the strength of their socialist economy is what they call their micro-entrepreneurship program. And the Chinese government that plans out the economy, one of the things it's constantly doing is helping people to start their own businesses as part of their planned economy.
And then it go by the resources too.
But is small businesses technically though capitalism? Because they're...
Well, that depends how you define capitalism, right? Is capitalism the profits being in command of the economy, or is capitalism just the existence of small stores and businesses? And that's where we are a little bit different in how we define it. We see capitalism as the anarchy of production. And if you have a state that abolishes the anarchy of production and organizes the economy, there's room for capitalism, if you want to call it that, of small business owners, etc. And actually the strength of socialist countries in our time is enabling such things to exist as part of the overall plan, right? And that is a reality. And if you go to Cuba today, if you go to Vietnam, they'll tell you we want to have a market sector, but we control that market sector.
They do.
Yeah, whereas in America,
it's better that way though.
Yeah.
It's a very different type of market too, to be frank.
Yeah, it's not a free market where chaos reigns. It's a market being strategically organized. You have a government that came out of an anti-colonial revolution that is controlling the economy and then enabling people to have their new idea. When I was in Venezuela, for example, there was a store there was a building. It's like a museum kind of. It's called the Center for African Knowledge. And on the top floor, there's a museum all about the history of Afro-Venezuelans. But to get up to it, there was like a ramp that went around, and it was like a mall. And like every store was Afro-Venezuelan businesses that the government had given a loan or a subsidy to create new hats, to create new bags, to create new, and we went all the way up to the top, and then they had this beautiful museum about it, right? And that it's the socialist government has loaned the money to start their business to enable to do that, right? In Nicaragua, the micro-entrepreneurship program, I saw that. And a lot of the businesses are cooperative, where the people who work in it, they all get a share, right? But it's still stimulated, it's still part of the planned economy. Go ahead.
You can't get that over here. We in competition all day and every day.
Yeah, and it's big monopolies.
It's like for instance, over in certain parts of Minnesota, this is what I learned. I've been up here 14 years. 14 years. It's, you go to a certain side, you try to blend in where you fit in. If you can't fit in that crowd, you out of the product. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You out of they comfort zone. You can't match up with them. You can't bring this together like anything, like a self, like you said, private. What you call a small business. Working for a person who got their own business, it's hard to keep up with them because they're in competition with you.
And they're suppressing people's...
Yeah. They'll pay you $11 an hour. You the one got the license. They don't got shit.
Right, and they suppress your creativity. You just do what you're told. Don't ask any questions. Don't have any ideas. Yeah.
I didn't have no ideas, but I gave some suggestions, though. But simple fact is, when I told them about the suggestions and the answer to their problem, they got mad, but they still
Of course they got mad.
Open, but I keep away from that damn kind of enemy.
Yeah, and that's the service sector, right?
Yep.
We're not stimulating creativity. We're not stimulating growth and all of that. We're just kind of all becoming cogs in the machine of the gigantic corporate monopolies, right?
I feel like that's what COVID was set up to do, was to just take over and,
Yes.
and stop everybody from operating, and then
got
your
it.
small business closed down because nobody
And-
can go out.
And drive everybody into the gig economy.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Now everybody got to order from Amazon and Target because they got the platform.
Right, and all the small stores and small restaurants closed down, and
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Minneapolis has really been affected by that, you know.
Yeah. And so we're in this weird position where it's like what people think of in America as capitalism, which is having your own business, having your own idea, is actually prospering more in the communist countries, right? And it's a weird situation. Go ahead, Peter.
The thing is the state control, the way that it's set up is that the state plans what to incentivize and what not
Right.
to. That's the difference.
Which is the thing.
It's ultimately, if you look at the way the state incentivizes or interferes with the market now, it's more just like public-private partnership type stuff. They're not really incentivizing anything.
It ain't.
They're more just working with existing massive entities.
Yep.
Whereas what Caleb's talking about with the small business stuff, they're using what is essentially a market mechanism with a plan at the top saying we're going to incentivize this type of business or this type of product or this, et cetera, et cetera. It's still planned,
Yeah.
more or
Check
less.
this out. I was working for this lady, right? This restaurant I'm going to tell you about.
Mhm.
Now, it was a small business, right? She put me, I was making $11 an hour. I had the state cert license, all the credentials. I was a culinary for this thing. But
Okay.
everybody in there was making 18 and 19.
Mhm.
So I worked for her for 2 years. And I kept on telling her, don't bite the hand that feeds you. If somebody, all the people that's working for you, they're ripping you off because their skills, their abilities, and their production is not productive. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, their skills are not adding up to your meal. You know what I'm saying? You might well take this and feed somebody else that's the script. And then when you get somebody on the outside that wants to help you with their business and then promote you and put you in a different perspective and make you go there, don't push them away. But like I told her, I'm gonna pray for her, better days for you, but I can't work for you no more.
Yeah,
And then now I'm working for a corporation. I look at Buffalo Wild Wings like I work with kids. I don't got nothing wrong with the kids. I don't got nothing against these monsters, okay? Because they're younger than me. I'm 50 years old. I got a 29-year-old daughter. I got 2 grandbabies. And then you look at the economy that I've been through. At 14 years. When I first got up to Minnesota, I didn't know nothing about Minnesota. I came from North Carolina, country girl, part of Chicago. I was staying in there too. But the South is me. Because the fact is, I see what it took my forefathers and the other people, fathers and brothers that crossed the line. It wasn't Columbia's only. It was God first. You know what I'm saying? God put everything together for a reason and season and a purpose. Order for us to stick together or we're going to fall apart. Or we can't collaborate about nothing these days. If you're
But I feel like that's how our society is like built up now, to where we don't have communities and
Yeah,
like
atomizing, breaking people down. Yes.
You don't like my talk.
As an Afro-American female in Minnesota, these 14 years I've been up here, I haven't found a group till I found this group. When I met Penny, I didn't know what this group was about, but now it's like, to me, this is about a whole chain of communities of greed, hurt, disappointments, letdowns, and all this other shit that's going on in this world. Instead of coming together, we fighting each other. It don't matter if we white, black, whatever color. And then for my race, the sisters I used to work with intimidated like a motherfucker. For real, I'm being honest with you. Don't be I think I'm an innocent person. I speak what's on my mind and I tell you the truth. When you hear the truth, listen and take heed. Because this bullshit we living in, this economy, this president, and then this government out here in Minnesota, it's finna go down. And people don't know that. A lot of people gonna be losing interest of what they so-called had, especially when they own shit. And then when the people who up here trying to build, they gonna grow if they are around the right people.
Yeah.
And if we ain't about growing, get your ass home.
Yeah.
Have a nice day.
There you go. Well, I just want to end this section, right? With just, no, you're fine, you're great. With one final quote. The last quote we have in there is very, very relevant to all that we're talking about. Right? This is the final section, because this is, Deng Xiaoping, when he changed the way China worked to have the mixed economy, the market sector, and he said we're going to get rid of impoverished socialism. He famously said poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. Right? And he wrote, he was drawing from Marx, who explained that the only way we can really have a society where everyone's equal, where everyone has what they need, is to get rid of scarcity. We need to unleash human growth and creativity to as high a possible level. So does somebody want to go ahead and read this last quote? And we'll talk about it, what it means, and then we'll end this section and take a break.
Communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor, has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety in society. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners. I don't understand.
Okay,
From each
it's fine.
according to his ability to each according to his need. I don't understand that.
Okay, the narrow horizon of bourgeois right is private property, right? It's, this belongs to me. This is mine. And the only way you can get to a society where no one has to own anything is where, you have a society where the subordination of the individual to the division of labor is gone, where no one has, there's so much wealth, no one has a specific job, right? Where the antithesis between physical and mental labor is gone. The idea we have some people who work with their minds and some people who work with their bodies. Well, technology has advanced to the point that doesn't exist anymore. A society where labor becomes life's prime want, no longer a necessity, meaning you only work because you feel like it. You don't have to work anymore because there's so much productivity in it that you work. Yeah, well, you work to not. Yeah.
I'm like, oh.
Right. After the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, meaning you're basically just free to be you, right? And the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, meaning there's so much wealth that's been created by the rationally planned economy. At that point, people can just do what they feel like doing and take what they need, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his need. So the need for private property goes away because there's just enough for everybody. And that's the goal. And what's weird is this is Marx here, right? And, we, the Center for Political Innovation, we believe this. And we hold on to this. And we are pro-growth. And we see that the problem with imperialism, the imperialist system, is that it's holding countries back from growing and it's keeping them in poverty. And it used to let us grow here at the expense of those countries. But now we've entered this fourth stage where they're degrowing here and they're collapsing because the system is in a crisis. And ultimately, if we want economic growth in America, we need a government of action to fight for working families. And if we can rationally organize the economy, we can unleash growth to the point that we can move toward a world where there's enough for everybody to go around and where we can have what we need. And there won't even be a need for a state or anything like that. We can get toward the ultimate goal, right? And we can get to that. And in a way, right, this all kind of ties back in with religion, right? We talk about, if you look at human history, right? Christianity, the Abrahamic faith, talk about the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, right? And the idea was Adam and Eve were in the garden, but they ate of the fruit and they acquired knowledge of good and evil. And so they were cast out of the garden and they had to work all of a sudden they didn't have everything they needed. They suddenly had knowledge that put them at odds with the nature around them. And then the Christian narrative is that through the struggle of human history, eventually there'll be an epic battle between good and evil, and we'll return to Eden once again, right? We will have acquired the ability to use our knowledge of good and evil in a way that we can make a world that's good for everyone. Right? And in ancient Greece, they talked about Prometheus. Right? In ancient Greece, the idea was that human beings were ignorant. And then there was one human being named Prometheus who stole fire from the gods. The gods had fire in their heaven or whatever. And he said, well, you know what? I want humans to be able to make fire. So he went to heaven and he stole fire from the gods and he gave human beings the ability to innovate, to create. And that launched human history. And what it means to be a human being is that you can be creative, that you can grow, that you can take the world around you and reinvent it in a new way and make your environment more comfortable and more prosperous. That's the nature of humanity. That's what it means to be a human being. And that's what we are advancing. We believe in growth. We believe in human creativity. And we're trying to build a movement to create a government here in America that is pro-growth and pro-working families and wants to unleash the productivity and wealth. The leaders of our country, they see us as an annoying horde to be managed. They're trying to drive down the population, and they want us to just kind of go away. They want to numb our minds with drugs and pornography and all kinds of stuff. And they're talking about how we're all going to live in a pod and we're going to eat bugs and we'll own nothing and we'll be happy about it. They're trying to destroy humanity. We're trying to unleash humanity, and we believe in growth. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation is all about. And that's why we give out an optimistic vibe. We want to inspire people to be creative. We want to help people celebrate the beauty of what it is that makes them be human beings. And
do you know why they want to depopulate and why?
Because they want to save their system. It's like we talked about in the beginning. It's degrowth, right? And this is called Malthusianism. At the time that the French Revolution happened, you know, it was because the feudal system was not sufficient and they needed to move toward capitalism. But the British had this guy named Robert Malthus, and he said, well, the problem is just there's too many people. And if we just drive down the population, there would be no revolution. And this idea that the problem is not capitalism, it's just there's too many people. And we need to cull the herd, degrow, reduce consumption, reduce the population. And it's the same thing kind of how the capitalist economy rebooted after World War II. They want to reboot by destroying. Right? Accumulate, and that's what fascist economics really is, and that's what our leaders believe. The only way they can stay at the top and keep their power is if they just destroy everything so that they can stay at the top.
How are they going to continue to make their profits if they depopulate, though? If they want to continuously make more and more money?
Well, you have to. That's the thing. Sometimes in order to make money, you got to spend money.
Well, and
like in this respect, it's
Peter.
Peter, you're telling the truth because like restaurants. I'm not trying to cut you off.
Oh, no problem.
I'll like restaurants, you notice something about it's so many restaurants got trucks, food trucks. I mean, they got what you call those people over them? The people, some real estate. In other words, like a company,
like a brick and mortar, versus
a company that delivers their food. Then you got other restaurants ain't doing that shit. They pay it out of their pocket. They want to be cheap. The budget, but that's an extra bill because you pay for all those costs and those expenses. Then you got to pay all these workers that you got working and all this stuff that you got gathered.
Yeah, but if you have constant more and more people coming and more and more people, but what I'm saying though is, I guess it's kind of confusing. Okay, yeah. I see that you're trying to destroy everything to stay in power, but are you trying to destroy just like? Who's going to be your customer after you rebuild?
And here's the thing.
Who's going to rebuild?
Well, first off, nobody. That's the problem. Is you can't actually it eventually. The problem is it heightens the crisis each time.
It gets worse each time they do it.
Now it takes us right back to the fact that you never pay workers enough to buy back what is being produced. It will always result in this situation, and that's the problem.
Right, but so then
it creates
once everything's destroyed, then we're gonna start over and go back to slavery, and then go back to.
No, they'll just start the economy again, and pretty soon it'll be glutted full of products, and they'll have to do the same thing all over again. But also, and this is important, some of the capitalists are going to get destroyed, and that's what we're seeing right now. Is that. There's a fight among the rich and powerful. Some of them are going to have to get destroyed in order to save the system, and some of them are going to make out like bandits and secure their monopoly, right? And just like in COVID, the small business owners all got crushed and the big monopolies, reigned. That's what the fight is about. And you see Trump up there ripping up the FBI and ripping up the CIA because he's working for some capitalists that felt the government was destroying them, so he's trying to rip apart their ability to do that.
That's why all these big organizations get popped off of.
So Denver was saying something. Denver hasn't spoken yet. Go ahead, Denver.
I was saying, I imagine they're not trying to destroy it completely, just bring it down to a level that's more manageable, less workers to pay out the wages.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to be able to equal out what's going out and going in. And in order to do that, you either have to destroy the productive forces or you need to have a war and destroy people. It's one of the two.
Yeah.
This is stressful.
Right, and
Yes, it is.
it is. And but humanity
Hard agree.
but humanity is saying no to it, though. Around the world, China's not accepting this. Russia's not accepting this. Why do you think they want to destroy Russia? They won't accept this.
But this
Cuba,
is the problem with
yeah,
capitalism, not like
right.
it's
All around the world,
immoral.
yeah. There's a section of the world that's not accepting
I agree
this.
that, like, you know,
Yeah.
if we lived in like a mixed society where we have some capitalism and some socialism,
Mhm.
like when it comes to like healthcare, like I highly believe that everybody should at least have, you know, their health intact in order
Right.
to
Yeah.
survive. And even like when it comes to like all the drilling and stuff that we do in America, like that should be owned by the people.
Yes.
It shouldn't
Hard
be
agree.
owned by like,
That's in our 4-point
you
plan.
know.
Yeah, we have public ownership of natural resources as our
But
second.
yeah, it just none of it just
No.
sounds like
Yeah.
we're ever gonna get out of this
Yeah.
until like we like get rid of those.
Yeah, our 4-point plan, the first step is to hire millions of Americans to rebuild this country. Pave the roads, build new railways, new universities, new power plants, etc. Second step is public control of our natural resources. So the wealth from our oil and our natural gas and all that goes into the public economy. The third
Well, that's what we're doing.
The third point is a national bank, a bank that would lend money in communities in order to stimulate economic growth. And the fourth point would be to then invest in our population by providing health care and education, et cetera. And with that 4-point economic plan, we would have a strong economy in America again because we'd be investing. But in order to enact that 4-point economic plan, you have to crush the power of the banks. You have to crush the power of the oil companies. We would need a government of action that was strong enough to beat back the power of the rich and powerful. But there'd be a lot of small business owners and capitalists, hotel chain who would benefit from it as well, right? We need to build a coalition against the big monopolies that sit at the center, an anti-monopoly coalition. And we're going to talk about that in the next class that I give. Peter's going to give a class, and then I'll do another one after that. We're going to talk about the struggle to create an anti-monopoly coalition. And that ultimately we need to build an anti-monopoly coalition to fight for working families. And around the world, there's big sections of the world that don't want imperialism and don't want degrowth. And they're the allies of us here in America as we're fighting what they're doing to them, right? And we need that economy around the world to get stronger over here. That's why we called for Trump to build a peace bridge connecting Alaska to Russia. We want to get away from the European economy and connect to the Russian Far East and to China and build a bridge over the Bering Sea. And that we need to, Donald Trump went to North Korea and he made friends with Kim Jong-un. We need to escalate that. We were at Trump's inauguration with a big banner of Trump and Kim shaking hands. And we're going to be in the streets of Minneapolis tomorrow with that, saying we support the peace talks and the war in Ukraine. And that ultimately we need America to join the new economy that's rising around the world. It'll probably be early afternoon, right? Maybe 1, 2. We'll talk about it here before we leave. We're going to do it as a surprise because we don't want to have problems like we had before. But yeah.
I mean, that ties back into everything too.
Well, and we'll be talking about that. But ultimately, we need America to join the new economy that's rising, and we need to build a movement in this country against the big monopolies. So
I mean, it just seems like it's almost like impossible. You don't even hear like any of your politicians talking like that or anything close to it. It just sounds good.
The reason Trump won the election, despite all the issues, I don't agree with Trump about immigration, I don't agree with Trump about a lot of things. The reason he won is because he was putting out a pro-growth message. And the people, he's saying, I want to make America great again by growing and constructing.
With
right?
Elon Musk?
Well, I mean, and Elon Musk's image, even though I think it's pretty fake, but his image is that he presents himself as an industrialist, like he's a manufacturer, and that they were kind of rallying the lower levels of business to try and say we want to push off the degrowth. And that's why he's breaking up the FBI and CIA, is because they are seen as vehicles that suppress small businesses and stuff. And there's a fight, there's a push and pull, but ultimately they're going to fail, right? Because only you can't cut your way into economic growth. And that's what they're trying to do. They think if they just get the government out of the way, they can have economic growth. It doesn't work that way. You can't cut your way into economic growth. We need a government of action to break the power of the big monopolies and start investing in communities. We need jobs, healthcare, and education. But in order to get that, we have to crush the power of the big monopolies. Right? And it's going to be hard for them to learn that because the people that are part of Trump's coalition, they believe in capitalism. They think we just don't have real capitalism. If we just privatize everything, get the government out, we're going to get what we want. It's not going to work. We need a government of action to fight for working families. The problem is, though, and the reason the reason the communists and socialists hate us is most of the communists and socialists have just become foot soldiers of the big monopolies. They basically
out there saying shit like you can't have an economy that grows.
Yes.
That's the problem. Like that's literally anti-socialist.
Yes, yeah, that most of the left have just become the foot soldiers of the big monopolies to try and stabilize U.S. society with degrowth. And in fact, they've put out pamphlets that socialism is degrowth. There's the top book, you can degrowth, a future beyond capitalism. They're promoting degrowth for the big monopolies. Whereas the lower level, like capitalists and business owners who want growth, they think the only way you can do that is with the free market. But they're going to learn pretty soon.
It's not even a free market, though. That's all fake.
Yep.
Well,
And it never has been.
It's a running theme.
Yeah.
It's not real.
But ultimately, we have to build the movement. And, we'll talk later about all that we've done. We're a small organization.
Yeah.
But we've moved mountains. I wrote a book about Kamala Harris, and my book was banned from Amazon.com. And it was called Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts.
Still is.
I wrote it, yeah. And it was the day she became the nominee, they banned it from Amazon. And Jimmy Dore,
It had been out for years.
it had been out for 4 years because I followed her. I'd had it for 4 years, and they took it down the day she
wrote it in 2020.
They wrote it in 2020.
But what it was about, you knew she wasn't going to make history anyway, done you?
Well, I wrote the book, and they took it down the day she got the nomination. You know what I mean? And then all hell was raised, and all kinds of people spoke out, and the book exploded in popularity, and we sold thousands and thousands of copies of it as a result, right? And we distributed 1,000 copies in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention.
Do we have any here?
No, we don't actually. I didn't bring any with me. But and that was huge. Also, we were at the inauguration with our Trump and Kim banner, and throughout the election, we were marching around the streets of New York City with this huge banner of Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands. And we marched around the streets of New York City, and that was mentioned in New Yorker magazine. They did a special. Like, look at this group that's out there saying we want peace with North Korea, right? And we have done a lot. I was able to. We led the American delegation. Russia had a festival of people from all over the world who want to be their friends, and we led the American delegation. And we were actually able to speak. You can watch the video of us speaking with Russian President Putin and saying the majority of the American people don't. And it's amazing with such a small organization what we've been able to do, because no one else is doing it, and the ideas that we have are very, very powerful, and they transcend the stupidity of the left and the right. So there you go.
Well, everybody else is protesting people who want to do it.
Yeah. What's up?
I would like to suggest this: every group you teach, like if more people you bring into this family, put it like this, I'll put it in that prospect of this family. More people you bring in this family. We all got to come together every day and talk to, be able to elaborate with each other.
Well,
on the outside too, and get to know one another, spending time with each other,
Yeah.
each other occupied, so we can know where we go from.
Well, I'm going to talk more about it. She gets it. Yeah, but as you know, our mission right now
We can't
is.
just go out there, like you said, March. Those
Yeah.
people out there, I'm telling you, Minnesota's something else. I don't see so many marches. I don't see so many fights. I don't see so many shootings. I was walking down the street just minding my business a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, why don't we?
On back of my legs, and from $2 I didn't even know, and I felt like there was somebody had something against me.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break so Peter can set up for the next class, and then we'll do the next class with Peter. Sound good?
All right, Peter.
All right. No, it's okay.
No.
It's okay. You're saying great stuff, and this is important discussion, but we're getting to the essence of what our movement is about. I have no idea. I turned my phone off and all of that. What time is it?